we discussed Sin City in the previous episode. Now we'll be discussing the sequel, Sin City: A Dame to Kill For. I'll describe the plot this time. Follows. It's kind of a prequel sequel. So the main storyline, the A Dame to Kill For story, is a prequel about Dwight set before the events of the first film. That's like the big storyline. But there's also a story focusing on Joseph Gordon-Levitt as this like cocky gambler who ends up like basically beating the wrong man. And then finally, you have a sequel to the Hartigan story in the first film, which focuses on Nancy, who has now become like all traumatized by Hartigan's suicide. And there's a prologue featuring Marv.
It kind of tries to imitate the structure of the first film, but quite a lot. Although I don't feel like it's quite as smooth this time around.
There's a lot of things that kind of pale in comparison.
Whenever I was watching it, for me, the Dwight story dragged on quite a lot. And it was also, I think, the same problem as the last one, the least interesting of the stories. It had good elements. Eva Green as Ava was quite manipulative, and that was fun to watch. Josh Brolin, as usual, gives a good performance, but I think the actual narrative was just, I don't know, it just didn't really work as much for me because I feel like Dwight was a much dumber character in this film than he was in the last one. It doesn't quite fly for me.
So I agree with that. I agree with the fact that it also kind of feels a bit too long. But the reason why I feel like that is compared to the first film, because although in the first film the Dwight storyline was longer than the other ones, the Marv story and the kind of Hartigan story, the length of both of those stories did help to kind of offset it because they were like around the same length. I mean, the Hartigan story was kind of split up in two, but in this film though, there's not. It kind of feels like that's the only story that has any kind of like substance because the gambler story, the Long Bad Night, that one is also split up into two. But I don't think it's a very long story. And I think the same goes for the Nancy story, which I think is only like 25 minutes or something.
Because I think the gambler story is probably around half an hour to 35 minutes at most. But the problem I find with the way that they use that, because they try and imitate what they did with Hartigan, which is where they split it up in two. And other than the fact that Hartigan's story was the last proper story in the original Sin City, so it made sense to cut back to it at that point and gave us the closure of what we started the film with, which was bookending in night, which is not the case for this film. Another thing that was an advantage for the Hartigan story is that we technically already had our closure on it the first time around. So when we revisited it, it felt more like an interesting surprise as opposed to, we've got to get back to that. That investment got sacrificed because they cut it off halfway through. And it didn't work almost like a self-contained short film like the first film's first Hartigan segment did. But, it was kind of just left us hanging a bit. And I think that really hurt the film because I still wanted to know about the gambler stuff because I thought, Joseph Gordon-Levitt gave a good performance and I was vaguely interested in that storyline. The way that I just wasn't interested in Dwight's as much because the film hadn't set up that investment for me yet and it hadn't given enough closure on the last bit for me to care about the new bit.
To bring it onto the film overall bit, so this isn't like a terrible movie by any means. It is very, very like painfully average. And the thing that I can say about any film or comic book or whatever that like Frank Miller has had his like name attached to is that normally like they're either really, really good or really, really awful. Like if you read a Frank Miller book or if you like watch a Frank Miller film, then like you're probably either gonna love it or you're gonna really, really hate it. But the thing about this film is that I feel like it's kind of hard to love or hate because it isn't as like misguided or terrible or anything like that as like The Spirit, which was the previous comic book film that he directed, which was truly awful. It's not as bad as that, but at the same time, it's not as good as the first Sin City. Blame can also be aimed at Rodriguez as well, because this one just doesn't have the same creative spark or like impact or anything. Like there's not a moment that kind of rivals anything in the first film. to me, what it kind of feels like is just another Sin City film. It has that energy of like what happens when you watch like a TV show that's maybe been going on too long, where like all of the same elements that you like are there, but the inspiration and the great quality that was there in like previously is kind of not there anymore. But the difference is that this is like movie number two.
There was stuff that I maybe wanted to revisit but wasn't revisited, and then there's some stuff that I just didn't, it wasn't enough to care about. And I think becoming an issue as the film went. I think, obviously going into it, the most interesting story that really should have been picked up from the first one is the Nancy story, because I was engaged for that, but it felt just really quick and not in a oh wow, that's driven and purpose driven. It felt more like, oh, we've got to include this story, and we didn't leave ourselves enough time in the script, and the studio wanted it to be this long.
And also it kind of justifies it being a sequel as well, because I mean the Nancy stuff does kind of come in the Long Bad Night, the gambler story. It kind of interrupts that story. But for the most part, this could have just been a full-on prequel. But I get that they wanted to like still make it a sequel, so they did include that story. I do agree that could have been that storyline could have been longer. But I also do feel, maybe with the exception of the A Dame to Kill For story, I don't really think that any of the stories necessarily justify their own existence. And as much as they try to, I don't quite feel like they necessarily justify being told. Again, they do sort of feel more like what you would get in like, the later season of like a TV show, or like the later film in like a movie series or something, where you think to yourself like, okay, all right, well this is kind of fun to see, but is it really like necessary for us to have this story be told? Like, to give you an example, the Long Bad Night, the gambler story, it's like they try and give it this sense of importance and tie it into the larger Sin City kind of storyline. But I don't really think that it was necessary. I feel like it could have just stood kind of on its own.
I don't mind the idea of it showing Rourke off to be this not great person, even though we already know that.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most believable story. Like, could see that story going down a lot more than probably some of the others, realistically.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's got that going for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the end, it's the one story that's got no connection to the original film, particularly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also one that doesn't particularly, it feels the most unnecessary.
I do think that if it had been just completely unconnected, then you could have still said that, but you could have also been like, well, I mean, it kind of just expands the world, and it's just another story that's being told in this world. But what they tried to do story wise, like to me, it just felt a bit like miscalculated, because like what they attempt to do is they attempt to kind of do this weird kind of narrative where it turns out that this Johnny guy is Senator Rourke's like illegitimate son, and I think that they were trying to do some kind of comparison thing between him, like this illegitimate son, and Rourke Jr., who was Senator Rourke's legitimate son. Like I think that they're trying to do it and trying to like make it another story about Rourke wanting to keep his legacy and reputation. But honestly, I feel like the Nancy storyline kind of covers that well enough anyway. All it really does, it shows that like Rourke is totally obsessed with like his image and again his legacy. But even then, I think like the fact that Rourke gets killed in the end, I feel kind of undermines that, because like who cares if, I don't know, he got beaten at poker twice, he's been killed, so he's not going to be able to live with the shame of that.
Yeah, he's just not going to have to deal with it, so it almost feels a bit superfluous to be there, because it doesn't need to be. I would definitely agree with that. I think it's almost is a story that didn't need to be told, and I think it's carried well by the actors. I think they do a really good job. I think it comes through quite nicely, most of it as well. But I ultimately kind of think, is it necessarily the film that needed to be made? And I think the honest answer to that is probably no.
And what's kind of hard to escape as well is that this film at the time in development hell. I even like as a kid, I even remember hearing about this movie like before it actually got made. I remember like hearing that they were gonna adapt it. that they were going to adapt the A Dame to Kill For storyline, into another film. So it did take a while to get off the ground, but then eventually they were able to do it. So I think that does give you like a bit more of an expectation that they'll like kind of have very, very good reasons to make another one. And that wouldn't necessarily exist if they had just made this immediately after the first film. The film, that feeling of like not a sequel that took a decade to make, but a sequel that took like a year to make. But at the same time, though, I mean, it's not, again, like, because it does have elements from the first film, like things that still work. It doesn't feel like a complete and total cash grab, because I do think that there are some elements to it that are kind of inspired. Like, again, the gambler storyline, I actually was quite engaged in that, and I did think that like the themes of that story did almost make it worthwhile. It's just again undermined by the final story. I do like the premise of the Nancy story. I do like the idea of like how of because it does give Nancy more of a character than just like a damsel in distress.
Yeah, and I quite like that she had the narration as well on the drive, and was almost playing the manipulative game. To be fair, she almost reminded me of a more morally decent Ava when she was going. The way that she was able to use different situations to manipulate them to her advantage, but with a better goal. And I quite
Oh,
enjoyed
okay.
that dynamic. But I almost wish it had either been explored more, or the gambler story somehow tied into it, so that then
Mm-hmm.
the gambler story felt a bit more relevant. I think that's my major problem with the film and the way it's kind of set up. The gambler story is never shown to have that much of an effect on Raw. It doesn't matter.
Those two storylines could have, like, since they share an antagonist, I think could have been melded together. But really, the only time they get brought together is just in that bit where you see Nancy considering shooting him. During the bit where he's at his poker table, you see Nancy. She has a gun. She's considering firing it, shooting him. So they come in that bit, but other than that, they don't really link. And I do, and yeah, it is true. Like that story could have been one story, in fact.
And if it had been put into tying it together, it might have actually been quite an interesting dynamic story. One thing I did appreciate about this version of the film, even though I think it was somewhat clumsily done, was it did give the female characters more, and actually allowed them to be characters as opposed to damsels for the most part. And it was actually
That's
quite interesting
true.
because I had them playing the damsels. It was a bit meta-textual in that way because I had them playing damsels and playing damaged women to get what they wanted, and make Sin City a little bit more interesting on that front, but also kind of counterbalances. I think Nancy's done really, really well. I think Nancy's done really, really well in the film. I think her
Yeah.
breakdown's quite believable. Her drive is good, and she kind of assesses her situation, realizes where her shortcomings are, and takes steps to counteract them. And I found that really, really interesting because it was a bit more of an intellectual play from her, which I liked. But
Yeah.
Ava, for me, kind of falls into she is definitely the femme fatale type. It's almost like uber femme fatale.
So I've read the original story, the A Dame to Kill For story. Whilst the film is for the most part pretty faithful, like to the narrative and kind of the spirit as well, there were some changes that I did notice, like that I had a bit of a problem with, but I won't really get into them now, just because I think they're a bit nitpicky. This one, they do slightly play up more the idea that she has this like weird control over people, because even for a manipulator, the fact that these people are like falling for her is definitely something that can be more chalked up to her being like a siren or something, or her being like a witch or whatever that can just get people to just do what she wants them to do. But that I don't necessarily have a problem with. But there are some aspects to this film that I did find to be kind of dumb and a bit like unintentionally silly as well.
I want to talk about the look of this film. And while
Okay,
it's
yeah.
largely consistent with Sin City, I think it's worse overall,
Hmm.
especially with the CGI car chases and things like that. They were clearly trying to step it up a little bit on the action department and stepping a little bit more away from the mood as such. But the problem that they had in this film, it just didn't feel believable visually. It's like the whites were a little bit too bright compared to the last one. for me,
Hmm.
and the way that things moved, it looked unreal rather than surreal for me.
I noticed the differences definitely. And I mean, really, I'm not sure why that would be. I think it could just be either different cinematographer, or maybe I think that they wanted to like kind of update it a bit. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mind the look that much. On a technical level, I did have some kind of problems with like some of the, well, I don't even know if you'd call this technical, but I did have problems with some of the makeup. I had a problem with the way that Marv looked in this film.
Yeah,
He looked very it like in the first one, the makeup that was used to transform Mickey Rourke into Marv was like seamless. You know, it was completely seamless. But in this one, it looked a lot weirder. It looked like it was. I'm wondering if they just like made the makeup process a lot more aggressive, or if they did it less, because it looked very different to me. You know, his face looked very different to how it did in the first film.
I think the makeup was less considerable in this one.
Yeah. Oh, and the same goes for, so in the Dwight storyline, what they're leading up to basically is, like, since it's a prequel to the first one, and he doesn't look like how he does in the first film. The entire point of the story is leading up to like when he changes his appearance. So for anybody who hasn't seen this film, basically what happens with Dwight is his ex-girlfriend Ava, she basically manipulates him into killing her current husband, and then what she does is like she shoots Dwight several times, and in the process ends up like damaging his face. And then what happens is like Dwight gets away, and then a situation comes about where he basically has to get plastic surgery to look different, so therefore he can then like kind of worm his way into confronting Ava again. And this makeup, it's supposed to make him look like how he did in the first film. But the thing is that although his face does look different, it doesn't really look anything like how Clive Owen did in the first film. Like his hair is on point, but his actual face, it looks different, but not quite the same as Owen's. And his voice also still doesn't really sound like Owen's. Like Clive Owen had a much like softer sounding voice, whereas Brolin all throughout is doing his usual like baritone, badass, gravelly voice, you know. So that is also kind of a distraction too.
I think Clive Owen's version of Dwight had this softer spoken mindset to him, and I think one of my biggest problems with Dwight's storyline is there's this constant insistence of oh, I can't let this get off of my head, I can't let this get out. Except that kind of struggle with the monster wasn't ever explored in the original.
This is a prequel, so I guess you can imagine in the first film, like by that point he's become a good guy, you know, or something like that.
Well, no, true, no, true, but I think that's the kind of struggle. The way he was talking about it, the way he was phrasing it, I don't think that's the kind of struggle that really ever goes away, especially when
Okay.
he was in the situation again. And I think I don't know. He felt like a much more wild character and less of a less calculated in this film. And I guess that he could have developed, but we didn't see enough of that development at the end for it to land for me.
All we can guess maybe is that like after Ava betrayed him, then maybe that personality went away or something. Like I can maybe buy him thinking to himself like, oh my god, I got like, you know, manipulated into like killing an innocent man, so maybe I don't want to. So forever he'd associate his like his, I don't know, his violent ways with that. So I don't think it's too unbelievable. I do sort of get what you mean. I do think that it's a bit like it's not quite clear, vague.
Which isn't too much of an issue, but it's enough of one that I find myself thinking about it.
Because in terms of time, we don't know how long the first Sin City film takes place after this one.
One thing that I found really, really weird is that Marv was there, helping Nancy go after Rourke. And from my impression from the original, he should have been dead at this point.
So I didn't notice that on viewing, but I saw some people point it out, and I was wondering. I wasn't going to point it out because you know, but it's good that you pointed it out. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. But I do think that like what I would say that flaw speaks to, what I would say that kind of continuity error speaks to more. It speaks to a couple of things, but what I think it speaks to more is that another kind of miscalculation they make is that I don't think that Marv is really the same character that he is in the first film. And I think the reason why he's not the same character is because I think that like the Rodriguez kind of and Miller as well, like they both knew that Marv was a very very popular character, so they wanted to incorporate him way more into this film. Like he's in practically every story aside from the gambler one, and he even gets like the first story as well. So it's that from the beginning is a sign that they're using him way more. In general, I felt with the writing from the Marv character is that he didn't really feel like how he felt in the first film. In this one, he felt more like everyone's best buddy that they could go to for help and that would gladly help them. Even at the beginning, he's shown like like attacking some like people who are setting homeless people on fire. So
He feels like more of a hero in this one. In the
yeah,
original, you got the idea that he didn't want to be a bad man, but you also didn't get the idea that he was particularly good either. He was kind of like this. I mean, he felt more like a force of nature than a man in the original one. In this one, that very more human side of him comes out,
yeah.
and I think it feels a bit jarring because it's not presented in the same way that his humanity is in the first one. Like he's very a clearly caring character, but it's always hidden underneath this sort of graphicness. And it's around the same time as the original Sin City because it
Mhm.
has to be. So that it's not. It doesn't make sense to me that he wouldn't be that way.
In the original A Dame to Kill For story, he does help out Dwight. So it is, and based on a brief bit that you see in the first film, I think it is somewhat believable that him and Dwight would be friends.
Yeah,
But
no, that makes sense. And I mean, he's quite protective of Nancy as well. And
yeah,
in the Dwight story, he's pretty savage. Although he seems to enjoy it more in this film than he does in the last one. Oddly, I know I've just said he seems more like a hero, but he also seems to enjoy what he does a bit more. Like in the original, it was more like kind of grim resolve, and he did enjoy it in the original. It was it was less about the violence than the killing itself, and more about him getting close to what he wanted. And I think
well, the way that I view like the Marv character in terms of like his morality is that he's kind of like the way that he is that if you don't screw with him, he'll be your friend. Like as long as you just don't fuck with him, he'll gladly be polite to you or whatever. But if you insult him, if you attack him, if you try and hurt him, then he'll unleash it and like just kill you. So to some degree, he was a bit more of I wouldn't say call him like selfish, but in the first film, in his storyline, he was definitely very like obsessed with like self-preservation and his own goals. But again, this film is much more like he is much more of a like again like everyone's buddy or everyone's like muscle, that will yeah. So it does feel yeah. It's not an entirely unbelievable character shift, but it does feel very weird as you're watching it. You do think to yourself like were they just doing this just because Marv was a popular character, because they wanted to like kind of soften him up. It could have been that.
could have been a way to stop him, but I don't think he needed softening, especially in the world that Sin City is, which
Hmm.
is a very not nice place, and it's full of people who are trying to do good are kind of inherently swept up in the violence of the place. And I think Marv was almost the perfect representation of that. Someone who wanted to do good things, but through the way that he was and the way that his life went and the way that his environment was, he was a violent thug, and I think it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but anyway, so another okay, all right. So there's one aspect that I kind of wanted to talk about, and that's the tone. Because so the tone in the first film, I felt was very consistent and very well executed. Like it was definitely very like silly. It was definitely very absurd in a few places, but for the most part, you could take it seriously. But this film, unfortunately, I found myself laughing in scenes that I wasn't supposed to, and I just want to hone in on the main aspect that made me just like it just cracked me up every time it appeared on screen. Ghost Hardican. Oh my god, that was so terrible. It would be one thing if he was just Nancy's. I wouldn't say conscience, but it would Nancy was just kind
His
of him.
imagination.
But it's basically shown that he's a literal ghost. Like ghosts literally exist in Sin City.
And it was really weird because he showed up in the background of Rourke's mirror, and it was like, and you kind of, and up until that point, I had just assumed that he was a figment of Nancy's imagination, so it was fine,
Yeah.
whatever. But then I kind of saw that, and I was like, wait, what? And then if I don't know, and I didn't even consider the fact he was a ghost until you mentioned it. So I thought somehow Nancy's imagination had affected Rourke's imagination. And I kind of sat there and went,
The way that I kind of knew that he was a ghost was like one, he had his own like internal monologue, and if you were hallucinating someone, would you really? I I don't know. I mean, well, I mean, you could come up with reasons as to why they'd have a like your imaginary memory of somebody would have an internal monologue, but but it was also just because like he was kind of like he felt like a separate entity. You know, he felt like it didn't feel like it was just Nancy imagining him. He felt like his own entity. But the big problem I have, it just made Nancy's like kind of downfall. It made it very, very hard to take seriously, you know? It made it, and like I think that they could have gotten across what they were trying to get across in a way that wasn't just so like absurd and like bizarre. You know, what it kind of reminded me of is it reminded me of like in Amazing Spider-Man 2 when you had like the ghost of Captain Stacy who was just like constantly appearing to Peter Parker and just kind of grimly looking at him. It was I don't know if it's better or worse than that.
well, I would say it's worse because at least in that one, it genuinely was a figment of Peter's imagination that his guilt was just making him
Yeah,
see everywhere. And it's
yeah,
not often that I defend the Amazing Spider-Man 2, but
yeah,
that, you know, yeah, that moment wasn't the worst thing about that film, and it sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
makes sense. It's Peter's actions in response to it that then don't make sense and make it suck. But
yeah.
in this film, it's not quite the same, and it was a figment of Nancy's imagination right up until the end. And I think if that moment in the mirror with Rourke hadn't happened,
Hmm.
that element would have been a lot more tolerable.
At the very least, you could have said like it could have been up for interpretation, but the end kind of removes all interpretation, you know. But yeah, and again, I think it just like yeah, in the first film, Jackie Boy did seem to be alive after being clearly killed, and there was that element. But again, there was a bit of interpretation. Like, is Dwight just imagining him, is he actually, or is he actually still somehow alive? You know. But yeah, and it wasn't as like just like goofy and weird, and I don't know, and there were and there were just a few other like brief minor scenes that I just found hilarious. Like in particular, like the bit, like probably the most like noteworthy bit is that in the final story, Senator Rourke, he has a photo of his son, and it's his son when he was the yellow bastard, and
Yeah,
that was really really bizarre. Like I know it would be the most recent photo of him, but why would you keep around a photo of your son when he looks like that? Why wouldn't you keep a photo of your son when he just looks like a normal person? You
well,
know?
I think especially because obviously he's quite clearly ashamed of his son ever ending up like that. It doesn't make sense for Rourke to have that picture on his iMovie because it makes far more sense to have for him to have the original picture. And I know the actual reason is because they didn't think that far ahead. But
I'm sure that that was just like a steal from the first film,
yeah,
or something, or just like a publicity photo or something, you know. But yeah, but I don't know. I mean, it could, and you know, and the only time you saw, you know, him looking just like a regular person was just in that bit on the pier in the first film. He did appear more in his yellow bastard state, you know.
yeah.
And I agree, especially the appearing in the mirror at the end. That was ridiculous. It's just stuff like that that kind of that does just sort of indicate that like it wasn't. I'm not going to say that Robert Rodriguez like phoned it in this time around. I don't think that he phoned it in. If anything, you can kind of tell that he was really, really straining to make a sequel to Sin City because you can see in like the amount of like recastings that they do and what else like even the fact that he just goes so far back to the same style. So I wouldn't call it phoned in because I do think that he was clearly trying. I do wonder if in the process he sort of was like losing sight of what made the first film work.
They acknowledged that the visual style made it work, but I think they took away from that. I don't think the misery was balanced out as well in this film. It felt a little bit too unrealistic because of the tone of the rest of it.
I guess you could say maybe the end of the long bad night because at the end of it obviously Johnny gets killed despite winning. that ending felt very in line with the first film. But the other stories as well essentially end with the good guy winning. Like in A Dame to Kill For, Dwight kills Ava at the end of the final story, like Nancy's Last Dance, I think it's called. At the end of it, she just kills, Senator Rourke, and that's it.
The problem with the happy endings in this one, I mean, other than the gambler's story, which ends very, very tragically, is that unlike the happy endings in the first one, they're not balanced and measured like they are at first.
Like, I wouldn't say that any of the stories have particularly like satisfying endings either. And I do feel like if they had gone more for the idea of like being kind of intentionally unsatisfying in the same way that some of the stories in the first film were intentionally unsatisfying, like in the first film, Marv gets like blamed for everything and like executed, so he did lose, but he also did win at the same time. Or even Hartigan, who kills himself, but Nancy's like still alive, safe.
Win a loss. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the first one. It was very much a push and pull. It felt balanced in a way that they achieve their goals, but they lose personally. I mean, the only one that felt like that was the gambler's story.
Yeah, because he ruined Rourke's reputation, but even then, it's like again, it does feel like a bit of a hollow victory.
Yeah, but the hollow victory was the whole point of Sin City. That was good. But when Nancy did it, it was just victory. And with Dwight, Ava wasn't likable enough for it to be considered hollow, and I didn't buy their relationship enough.
She was just a pure villain, and he was defeating a villain, and if anything, it was a good thing that he killed her. It wasn't like they had a tragic love story that ended with her turning evil or anything. It was like she was just evil all the time, and he at the end of it took like just kills her, and then and that's kind of a good thing, at least in my opinion. Like, I also want to touch on as well, like, so in the first film, I do feel like those hitmen bookending scenes quite worked because it tied the story together. It prevented the stories themselves from feeling too disparate. It wrapped it up in a package.
Well, it was a great hook for the first one, and the last one gave us closure for something in an earlier story that we didn't have closure for.
But this film, unfortunately, it lacks anything like that, because it opens with like Marv. It's called Just Another Saturday Night, and that is basically what it is for Marv. It's just another instance where he finds some people, beats them up, whatever. And that would have been fine. The big problem, and this is easily the worst aspect of the film by far, like the film literally I can't even say it ends, it just stops. It, like the final story with Nancy, It does have what you could consider like a climax with her like storming the mansion, and then she kills Rourke, and then it just like cuts to black, has a couple of lines from her, and then the end credits. Like there's no like epilogue, there's no wrap up.
Almost like a climax without any resolution.
I'm wondering why they ended it like that, and a part of me wonders if it's just because they couldn't think of anything to include afterwards. I feel like they just kind of said, all right, whatever. She's won.
I think what would have been interesting if after she's won, just seeing the effects on her, like, does she go back to the strip club or not? Does it break her? Does it not? How does she, how does she respond to it? Does it change anything?
Does she become like a lunatic? Because I mean, she was already showing signs of becoming one. But if there was any kind of an epilogue or an ending to put in, that would be it, or even like something that would have brought the Hartigan story like full circle with like maybe, I don't know, she kills herself too. Like that would have been a very like tragic ending. But
how the hell she ends up in the apartment where Marv comes to see her would have been nice too, because that has to happen after this happened. It does actually make the first one a bit weirder, because why wouldn't the Cardinal mention that his senator's son had been shot in the head? Because that had to take place after this happened.
And another thing I noticed as well, and this is probably more minor, but Nancy didn't look the same that she did in the first film. In the first film, she had a very specific appearance, but in the sequel, her like it was mainly her hair. Her hair looked very, very different in this one. I'd say that that's a bit more forgivable, but that could have easily been remedied by just removing Marv from the Nancy storyline. It especially kind of felt a bit redundant because he had already been in the Dwight story helping out Dwight. So he didn't need to once again be helping somebody storm a mansion because he's already done that. And also I noticed that there's like 3 scenes in this film where people storm mansions as well. It's like you had 2 in A Dame to Kill For and you had 1 in the final story. I agree that continuity error would have been fixed if they just removed Marv. The one thing I do actually have to say though about the Nancy storyline, and this is very, very shocking to me, is that and let's like touch upon the acting a bit. Like Jessica Alba's acting was actually legitimately good. Her acting as Nancy during like when it was showing her breakdown was actually convincing. Like actually, it was very good.
Well, the thing is, I think Jessica Alba could be a really good actress. It's just she's not often directed very well because have you heard her talking about the second Fantastic Four film before?
I know that she doesn't like those films that much.
No,
She felt like she was too like sexualized.
Well, I think I mean, for the second one, I can't remember if it was a direct. I'm pretty sure it was a director, but literally said to her, "Oh, can you cry prettier?" And she went, "I'm sorry."
Oh yeah.
It was no, cry pretty, Jessica. That's what they want to see. It's almost that sort of thing. I feel like when the director can stop noticing how attractive she is throughout 5 seconds, that's when you get a good performance out of Jessica Alba because she actually has something to support her and work with her because she's a talented actress. She's been good in films before, but I think the problem is those films are not the high publicized ones. I think the problem is she's very much got very pushed into like kind of the Hollywood leading lady type for quite a bit, and almost was often directed to have the worst aspects of that all at once. And I think it's the same reason why. If I watch a Vin Diesel film, I know I'm going to be mildly entertained, but I know I'm not. I don't go into it expecting amazing acting. I expect mumble grabs.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's actually one good thing about this film that it gave her the chance to actually just
to act. And act very well. Actually, surprisingly, it did. Like I noticed that some people like online said that acting wasn't that good in this film, and I totally disagree. I thought her acting was actually it's a bit hampered by the fact that the writing just isn't that convincing. But I do feel like in those moments where it does show her, like, her acting out her kind of breakdown that Nancy goes on, again, she actually does sell it. She actually does convince, I feel.
I think it's one of the film's better performances.
I thought that the acting, for the most part, was as strong as the first film. I think again, certain performances are a bit stronger. Like to give, so obviously it says Alba, but there's also like I think that Powers Booth does really well with like a more expanded role. In this one, he's actually very, very like menacing and very like intimidating. Mickey Rourke is still good as Marv. He's not as good. He was a lot better in the first film because he had more to do, but he still does a decent job as Marv. Brolin, I thought was like fine. I thought he was serviceable. I didn't think he was amazing. He was kind of just doing his thing, but he was good.
He's kind of on his normal good, but the writing doesn't support him being better.
In the Dwight storyline as well. So they recasted Manu. They got like Dennis Haysbert from like 24 or something, and I thought that he kind of paled in comparison to Michael Clarke Duncan because Duncan was just so naturally intimidating. And even though they made the Manu character a bit more threatening, I didn't think that Haysbert's performance was that good. I didn't think he had much presence in the role.
To be fair, it's pretty tough to stand up to Michael Clarke Duncan.
Yeah,
in that way, but he didn't feel like it. Like Michael Clarke Duncan, I always had gone, you've forgotten, no hope.
But Haysbert just felt like the regular, like just like a sheet of muscle essentially, and it's like, yeah, sure, that's intimidating, but the man himself was not projecting any menace to speak of.
They kind of played it like he died when Ava shot him.
I think in the original story that's something they kind of clarify a bit more, that he isn't totally dead and was just incapacitated. I think
it was literally just the way he fell and the way everything happened. Like that's just a traditional death shot, the God's eye over him, and I was kind of there like, why would you do it like that?
As for the other acting, I mean, I thought that Joseph Gordon-Levitt did a really excellent job. He really sold that, and it's weird because I don't normally associate with him with roles like that, but he did play that kind of that cockiness really well. Like that cockiness just felt natural. But the person who steals the show by far in a lot of different ways is easily, Eva Green as Ava. Like she chews scenery. I think she sold like the pretend damsel in distress aspect, and she also sold the evil conniving aspect as well. If anything, she definitely I felt that she like raised the material by far.
No, I would say she did. I was impressed with her performance.
I was also impressed with the fact that I think that there's only like 20% of scenes where she's like clothed. Like every other scene is her like completely naked. It's her like, in a bath, or her like having sex, or her like just on a bed just like naked. And it's like I don't know that many actresses who would be willing to just do that, like to that level, to that excessive amount. Again, it's faithful to the original story. It was like all the scenes that she did are scenes that were in the original story. So, so I have to give them credit for like being faithful in that aspect, because not many movies would do that.
I think it was slightly overdone sexually in some ways, just because it was so in your face about it. I felt like, its intended effect kind of weakened over time, because you were just kind of like, oh, okay. I don't know. I feel like nudity and violence in film should elicit a strong effect. You shouldn't be able to go dead to them. But in this film, I was kind of dead to it.
It's the one aspect that's like more increased over the first film, but like the violence, the violence in this film to me felt a lot more toned down. And I know where that comes from. I think it comes from the Dames Killfall story wasn't particularly violent, but even in terms of like the stuff that they did have, for the most part, it was just like the most that you got is like you got like the bit where Manute's eye gets taken out. You got the bit where Dwight's eye was bulging out of his face, and you got the bit where Johnny got his fingers broken. But those were kind of just fleeting. There wasn't a moment of violence that like really really made you like cringe like in the first one. Like there wasn't like the various scenes of people getting just punched in the face. There wasn't like the torture stuff. There wasn't the bit where there wasn't any like castration like there was in the first film. It was, and all of that stuff happened without you getting numb to it or anything. Like it still had its impact by the time it happened for the 35th time.
It kind of lost its bite, and I think the first one never stopped feeling visceral. Its violence was less apparent. It was, it wasn't quite as on top the whole time. Also, nastier than this film was. So you felt a lot more.
There was way more like torture, but in this one there was only like I think there was only like one scene of torture, but aside from like with like again Johnny getting his fingers broken and punched in the face repeatedly. But aside from that, I mean it did. The only time that they really in any way extended it a bit was in the bit where he sees Christopher Lloyd in his cameo appearance as that doctor who like set his fingers back. Like so with that, I think they were trying to like get a reaction out of you, But again, it's like fingers being broken. I don't think that's that like that
it's
is
not
that
quite the same as someone being punched until their heads are liquid.
I think to kind of wrap it up, this isn't what either of us would call like one of the worst like comic book sequels ever.
I'm not sure I'd even call it particularly bad. I just think it's aggressively mediocre.
Like I said, it's not even in the pantheon of like disappointing comic book sequels. I can think of way more disappointing ones, but this one, overall the worst aspect about it overall is just that it just kind of lacks what the first film had in a lot of ways. It just kind of feels like a bit of a hollow recreation of the first film, but it doesn't have the point. It feels muddled. It feels miscalculated. There are certain elements that just either just aren't executed well, or just are hard to take seriously. It has like at its best, it's an average bit of like style over substance. I think that's what I'd call it. Like it's like cool style, some good action, good acting. It just isn't like a complete package overall.
It's got the ingredients but doesn't quite use them correctly. So it's not. I wouldn't exactly recommend the film, but I wouldn't say don't watch it either.
If you watch the first film and you're hungry for more, then it probably is worth watching in that regard. But it's not really like a necessity or anything. It doesn't like in terms of films that are like part of a franchise or films that are part of a series. There are some films that I wouldn't consider to be that good or would even consider to be bad, but that I would still say were kind of necessary parts of the story. But this one, I don't really think is necessary enough. Again, unless you really want to see what Dwight was doing beforehand or see what Nancy did afterwards. Aside from that, it doesn't quite justify its own existence in that regard. As for what we're going to discuss on the next episode, do you have any suggestions for that, Jack?
I think it might be time for our Dracula week. Horror of Dracula, also known as Dracula over here, which is the Christopher Lee version, and the Bela Lugosi version.
Okay, so yeah, you want to do a comparison between both of them? Yeah, I haven't seen either of them, so this will be new for me. But
I've seen both of them multiple times. They are fantastic.
Yeah. So that will be the next episode, and then next week we'll have a choice for the week afterwards. Yeah, good. Okay.
Can't wait to have that discussion.
Yeah, great. So yeah.